Let me just start by thanking Alfie, my colleague, my friend, Helen as well, for hosting me. I'm so flattered by the invitation. I also want to thank my teacher, my forever teacher, Frank Ruda. He did help me workshop this paper. So the talk is called Hegel in Cyberspace. Here we go. Between 1805 to 1807, Hegel hand-wrote his manuscript, Phenomenology of Spirit. His publisher, Hegel, which if you know, he was under a great deal of pressure to finish his manuscript, transposed the handwritten text into block letters, printed the arranged text onto a page, and bound the final copies. Hegel would never have used a typewriter. But during Hegel's lifetime, the newspaper rapidly increased its daily runs throughout Europe. In Terry Pinkard's biography of Hegel, he notes that, I quote, "Improvements in printing technology in England had made newspapers there more readily available. The Times had gone from being printed at 250 sheets per hour in 1813 to 4,000 sheets per hour in 1829, and hence a new force of public opinion was suddenly being created." End quote. Hegel was known to read the newspaper every day and to discuss philosophy and political events with his family and colleagues. One of his famous aphorisms, which was published posthumously by Karl Rosenkranz in Königsberger Literatur in 1842, states, "Reading the morning newspaper is the realist's morning prayer." So was this just a glib comment that information had come to replace faith? Perhaps and perhaps not. It seems a better reading of this extract from Hegel to mean something else, that the rise of print media signified a new step in Spirit's historical progression. The word had gained rapidly greater circulation. It's certainly cliche to call the internet the new printing press, but it nonetheless presents a new configuration of Spirit, a new arrangement of recognition, new forms of community, newly shared ambitions, and newly shared culture. Spirit is a word I will use throughout this presentation. If we don't know, it's from the German word Geist, which can be translated as spirit as well as mind. Spirit, in short, is a transcendental and shared understanding. It's a collective awareness and realization of freedom in which spirit is the author of its own world. Hence, the increasing industrialization of the newspaper during Hegel's lifetime had a direct impact on the organization of spirit. The spread of a common text broadened the spirited community. Hegel, of course, has not lived to see the development of the internet, but what might we be able to learn from his writings on the new organization of spirit within cyberspace? What might we learn about the logic of cyberspace and its materiality? What I'm interested in this talk is an ontology of cyberspace. Put simply, what is cyberspace? How can we discuss its ontic manifestations as well as its ontological horizons? I draw on Hegel reading his system as one that is ontologically both idealistic and materialistic, as a system that demonstrates the simultaneous irreducibility between and co-constitution of thought and being. Specifically, I read his encyclopedia broken into 3 volumes, The Logic, Nature, and Spirit, as presenting 3 registers of ontology. Logic is not nature, is not spirit, etc. These 3 systems are incompatible and yet are woven into each other. What I mean by this is that in order to conduct an ontological investigation of cyberspace, I propose examining the logic of cyberspace, the nature of cyberspace, and the spirit of cyberspace. These 3 readings will not unify. Rather, they will unify precisely through their disunity, and perhaps in understanding the insurmountable gaps that would be presented between the logic, nature, and spirit of cyberspace, we will better understand the contradictions that uphold the very edifice of our shared virtual world. The paper has 6 sections. First, why cyberspace? Why not the digital? Why not the internet? These terms, of course, are closely related and will likely bleed together at various points throughout this paper, as they do in everyday speech. Cyberspace is a term I choose to investigate precisely because it implies a new type of space, a new organization and arrangement of objects, and a fundamentally distinct negativity between them, a cyberspace with cyber objects. Space implies an external relation of objects, per Hegel's discussion of space in the philosophy of nature. Space is likewise indifferent to these objects, being itself completely penetrable. If we think of a space of logic and a space of spirit, we can likewise ask, how does cyber logic arrange its elements, specifically via its binary and algorithmic apparatus? And how does a cyber spirit or spirit's development in cyberspace arrange itself, alienate itself, return to a unity with itself? Space is ontologically grounded in Hegel's 3 texts in the encyclopedia. In the logic, a space of indeterminacy, a void, and emptiness famously opens the logic. He asks, being pure being, and he talks about how it's fundamentally empty, it's void, it's Leere in German. Thus I will ask, what is the spatiality of cyber logic? Where is there a space of indeterminacy? The second text in the encyclopedia, The Philosophy of Nature, grounds nature in natural space, in its indifference, its extension, its homogeneity. Nature is then arranged logically by Hegel, beginning with the sublation of the point. The way to read the nature is to read nature as fundamentally indifferent until it is arranged logically by spirit. So hence, I ask, how has a cyber nature emerged from the material organization of cyberspace? What is the ontological standing of nature via the digital? The third and final text of the encyclopedia is on spirit, in which spirit emerges from nature as an externality that has once again externalized and alienated itself. This is the spatial development, a continuous alienation. Spirit necessitates space to step outside of itself. Thus, I will investigate cyberspace precisely as a further alienation and externalization of spirit, and how its unique logical structure impacts the development of spirit. But first, section 2, the etymology of cyberspace. Let's ask where this word comes from. The word cyberspace, it crops up here and there in the 20th century, but as a term, it was properly coined by William Gibson, the famed science fiction writer, first in the 1982 short story Burning Chrome, and then in his well-known 1984 novel, Neuromancer. The term cyberspace appears in his cyberpunk universe. Gibson writes, I quote, "Cyberspace, a collective hallucination experienced daily by billions and billions of legitimate operators," end quote. But surely we can no longer say that cyberspace is a hallucination. It appears in a very real way on our computers, tablets, cell phones. It's composed of real material objects. It facilitates real interactions, carries on its pages real and fake information. It has real implications. When asked about coining the term cyberspace, Gibson said that cyberspace as a word seemed, I quote, "evocative and essentially meaningless," end quote. So has the term cyberspace stayed evocative and meaningless? Well, what we learned from Lacan is that we cannot maintain control over the signifiers we introduce into the broader symbolic. They will grow legs and walk around, and here I'm taking the term cyberspace on a bit of a speculative stroll. So let's go further back in time, before Gibson and the cyberpunk universe. Let's look at the Greek etymology. The term cyberspace, unsurprisingly, does not appear in ancient Greek. The closest word we have is kybernetes, which translates into English as cybernetics. Kybernetes in Greek means helmsperson, that is, the person who steers a ship. If you've ever steered a boat, you'll know that you're constantly responding to your own steering, to how you've just moved the boat, and you keep adjusting accordingly. The helmsperson is the person who responds to her actions in this way and is navigating a feedback loop. Relating to kybernetes, the word kubernao means to steer. Thus, the prefixes kyber and kuber may never appear on their own in ancient Greek, but nonetheless, we can derive a meaning, feedback. As we steer into the sea and into cyberspace, what we are really doing is steering through a feedback loop. Cyberspace is in its very self a space of feedback, a space where spirited beings have created meaning, stored traces of themselves, created pages of text and images, built games to play. It's a space of our own spirited feedback. The word courbet actually refers to the turnable wooden cylinders the helmsperson would have steered with. So wooden cylinders, are these not the material excess to what it means to steer? We may think of contraptions, the batteries, the CPU chips, just as we think of these wooden cylinders. They are the material excess to spirit's voyage. When Hegel writes spirit is a bone, this means that even the immaterial, transcendental spirited being has a material remainder. We are spirited, but we are nonetheless embodied. With the helmsperson, she might steer the boat into spirited exploration of the great beyond, but she must do so aboard a material wooden vessel. She must turn some wooden knobs in order to open the gates of adventure, as it were, to spirit. And this is precisely the case with cyberspace. There is some crude material remainder to cyberspace itself. None of this stuff, the routers, the play of light, the broken iPhone screens, this laptop, none of this is cyberspace. It isn't. It's this materiality, this contingent necessity to the transcendental realm of the digital. Thus, one central thesis I'm presenting is that cyberspace is a space of feedback that spirited beings navigate, create, and cope with. Unlike the revolution in print media, the digital revolution means that we can stare back at ourselves, our profiles, our own websites. Indeed, recall that one of the first massively popular websites that revolutionized internet culture was called MySpace. Users were able to call a little corner of the internet their own, curate their social profile, and produce a space of spirited feedback as they produced a digital self. I mean, in some sense, the MySpace users were like these serfs in Tom's fiefdom, right? And Tom was the creator of the whole thing. He was like omnipresent in there. But you had this little piece of the internet you could cultivate, a plot that was an externalization, an alienation of yourself. an externalization that nonetheless returned to contribute to a sense of self, to the infinite judgment of the I. So let's get into the meat of it. Section 3, we're going to look at the logic of cyberspace. So cyberspace is, of course, predicated on a binary logic, as well as the logic of the algorithm. When fiber optic cables shoot light over vast distances, the play of light indicates either a 0 or a 1. One of the most common ways to indicate zeros or ones via light is to assign 0 to no light or 1 for light. There are other ways as well. Light can pulsate at a rate of 800 times per nanosecond in a fiber optic cable, transmitting information in a process called packet switching, wherein the information has been compressed into zeros and ones in order to indicate a destination and a message. In the philosophy of nature, Hegel writes that electricity is, I quote, a light which is pregnant with difference, end quote. The zeros and ones of binary logic represent a logic of determination. At their most elementary level, the zeros and ones are meant to distinguish between being and non-being. Is this a simplified movement of the negative? A dialectic between what is and what isn't? Is dialectric synonymous with dialectic? In the quality section of the logic, Hegel writes that determinate being is, I quote, negatively determined not only towards an other, but absolutely within it. This negation in it, in contrast at first with the finite something, is the infinite. The abstract opposition in which these determinations appear resolves itself into oppositionless infinity, into being for itself, end quote. So, chunky Hegel quote. Any determined being, we learned when reading the logic, is not separated from its other in a cut and dry way. Being itself contains its negative determination, absolutely within it, as Hegel says. A finite being engages in an infinite negation with its correlative non-being. The finite being and its infinite negation unite into a new infinity, into what Hegel calls being for itself. So, this is decidedly not the simplistic division of zeros and ones. The most basic distinction here is that Hegel grounds his system of logic in quality. We first come to determine what beings are in their rich multivariate iterations before we start to group them together and count them. Binary logic is, of course, a quantitative logic, a flattening of the nuanced composition of our qualitative world. Here we can specifically see the ontological implication. The infinite interplay between being and non-being, the co-constitution between what is and what isn't, is simplified into two placed digits, two representatives of that which is and that which isn't. Data scientists report that at bottom, they have to reduce their quantification of data to either a 0 or a 1, either a yes or a no. Is this quality represented? Does this user like to shop at this particular online store? Even if the data scientist produces qualitative analysis, the analysis is based on binary categorization. Even if what you see on your screen is an interplay of color, at bottom, the screen is pixelated. At the heart of this flattening is an indifference to difference, and this indifference will make all the difference in the composition of cyberspace. Taking a page from Donna Haraway's 1985 Cyborg Manifesto, she writes, quote, communication sciences and modern biologies are constructed by a common move, the translation of the world into a problem of coding, a search for a common language in which all resistance to instrumental control disappears and all heterogeneity can be submitted to disassembly, reassembly, investment, and exchange, end quote. Haraway points to coding as an instrument of control, both in communication sciences and in modern biologies. I'm, of course, talking about the former. As she points out, coding and quantification have value as an exchange. Numbers are fundamentally transitive. They can be swapped out for one another. Qualitative characteristics, these require context to make sense. They differ in different situations. Numbers, however, are interchangeable and thus have an exchange value that abstracts from quality. This is, of course, Marx's argument regarding the exchange of capital. Capital quantifies a labor value that is necessarily qualitative. Reading Hegel's quantity section in The Science of Logic, Hegel writes, quote, quantity is the determinateness which has become indifferent to being, a limit which is just as much no limit, being for itself, which is absolutely identical with being for another. So there's several things I want to unpack in that quote. First, quantitative determinateness is indifferent to being. It's exchangeable and transitive. The exchangeability and transitivity of cyberspace's logic lends itself perfectly to be overlaid by a capitalist logic of quantification. It is as if the logic of capital found the perfect tool of communication to go hand in hand with it, with its own accumulating logic. And there's, of course, much to be said about how the internet was an overnight boom, a Wild West, a California gold rush, particularly in the making of overnight fortunes, fundamentally transforming the market as we know it. Second, in this quote, Hegel writes that quantity is a limit which is just as much no limit, which points to another Hegelian concept, the bad infinite. The bad infinite can be spatially rendered as an uncontained infinite. It just keeps going. Earlier, we saw an example of the true infinite, that being for itself is an infinite relation between being and non-being. There's a productivity and a resolution in the true infinite, unlike in the bad infinite. Mathematically, the bad infinite can be rendered as n plus 1. We just keep adding new terms in a way in which we become frustrated. There's no resolution to the bad infinite. The quantitative or bad infinite in the case of cyberspace means that there is a nonstop production of quanta, of algorithms, of web pages, and of data. Data, for example, exponentially grows. The amount of data online worldwide grew 20% just between 2023 and 2024, and it's set to grow at an even faster rate over the next 3 years. The internet keeps growing precisely because it's a fundamentally quantitative logic. It's a bad infinite. In this sense, we can see how the logic of the internet produces undesirable outcomes in terms of feedback. We've created something endless, precisely in the sense that we do not arrive at a clear ending or goal. We just keep creating more websites, and people, this is the libidinal effect. They seek more followers, more likes, more clicks, right? It's quantitative. So to develop this point a bit, one disturbing element of this exponential production of data is that data has been commodified. We have fundamentally transformed our labor relations in this regard, insofar as us online users who click and scroll are creating data for free. Companies profit off of selling our data, and we hand it over without any compensation. It's a very dark twist of capitalism, and cyberspace uniquely obscures this fact because clicks and scrolls are, of course, enjoyable and addictive. Coupling this observation with the bad infinity of data, capitalism has indeed created a new market that's both growing and devaluing itself, structuring a new crisis as more data is produced, thus undermining its value, yet operating as more and more valuable as commerce increasingly shifts its weight into the cyber world. Finally, in this previous quote from Hegel, he writes that quantity is a being for itself, which is absolutely identical with being for another. Same quote as before. Again, the logic of the internet is transitive, not just at a level of zeros and ones. 10 followers are worth 10 followers, 100 clicks are worth 100 clicks. Sure, people attach some value to the type of followers you might have, but it's again quantitative. Other people with lots of followers follow me, for example. This numerical equivalency results in the flattening of the world, of relations with the world, of spirit itself. What we learn from this one quote is that cyber logic is indifferent to being and is endlessly and unproductively extensive, one which I've argued here lends itself rather well to a capitalist piggyback ride in revolutionizing the exploitation of labor and in the creation of new commodified objects, i.e. data. In the same quantity section, Hegel continues, he writes, quote, determinateness is as such outside of itself, an absolute externality, end quote. Just a quick note on this, quantity is an external form of determination. So if our representations of ourselves are strictly quantitative, that is attached to a number, for example, likes, followers, clicks, then our determinations of ourselves, of our spirit, is outside of us. He continues, I quote, the content of numbers is the empty one. So the solid nourishment of moral and spiritual life is to be ousted by this one which is void of content, end quote. Hegel outright tells us in this passage that quantity deprives both moral and spiritual life of nourishment. What is the reason behind this? In this quote, he writes that the one is empty. Well, how could the one be empty? Because I thought we just distinguished between 0 and 1 based on being and non-being. Surely the one must be full. Without getting too deep into number theory, the one is said by Hegel to be empty because it references only itself. This is like a Parmenidean argument as well. If it had any content, it would be referencing that content, but the one is, of course, it references nothing in particular, hence it's empty. The irony at play here is that zeros and ones are not so distinct after all. The one is empty like a 0. The 0 holds the place of a number, counting itself as 1 per Frege, the German mathematician. But it's a whole story there. But the point is that zeros and ones are theoretically entangled. But like the rejoinder here is at the same time, binary logic could just use other symbols, and some do. They use T and F for true and false, for example. So the implication really here is that with binary logic, the terms are distinct and do not overlap. So what we learn in reading the logic is that being contains its negation absolutely within it, as we read earlier. That's what being is. One way to look at it. And this is at the heart of what's really undermining about cyber logic. We cannot program contradiction into cyberspace. Programs are programs. They execute the tasks they've been designed to execute. It's definitionally impossible to program contradiction into the program. Sure, ChatGPT contradicts itself. It contradicts a user's input. It hallucinates. But this is not a contradiction of its actual being qua programming. What AI fundamentally cannot do is step outside of itself, step outside of its programming. It literally cannot be programmed to do so. The phenomenon of self-consciousness is that we as spirited beings step outside of ourselves and look back at ourselves. The binary as well as algorithmic logic of cyberspace that is a logic based in quantity, I argue, bars AI from inhabiting the contradictory position of the spirited subject. What this means, to conclude the section on cyber logic, is that cyber logic may appear to operate on the fullness and emptiness of zeros and ones, but both of these terms are in fact spatially full and flat. They cut up a world of nuance in a flattening manner, with non-being itself, instead of maintaining its negativity, is given a full place as a zero term, which could just as well be a T or an F. Hegel calls the numerical one empty, which it is in its concept, but here in its utility, it's just used to fill a place. Cyber logic is therefore always placed, calling into question if there is a space of logical indeterminacy that enwraps its determinations. Section 4, we're going to talk about nature. So what's the relationship between Hegel's logic and nature? This is a big question. In contrast to logic, nature is external and immediate. It's sensuous materiality. Nature poses itself as one of the most challenging ontological registers because it raises the question, how can we discuss nature in itself without logic and without spirit? Unless we are speaking of a pure space in itself, we are always speaking of a logically organized nature, a logically organized space. As spirited beings, we weave logic into nature in order to organize what is, according to Hegel, just contingency. We transform its indifferent space into place. So how have we organized nature according to the logic of cyberspace? It's evident that the nature of cyberspace, its cyber materiality, is one of feedback and interconnectivity as it's physically constructed by thousands of kilometers of cable. It is likewise sustained by massive amounts of energy, tons of batteries and data centers that we do not see when we open our computers. These places are not significant to cyber places. As mentioned earlier, the hardware of cyberspace, which is in itself a necessity, it is a contingent necessity. This is what nature is for Hegel. This is a direct quote from Philosophy of Nature. Nature is only necessity and contingency. Hence, like with the helmsperson who turns wooden cylindrical gears in order to steer the ship, when we think of sailing and cresting into a new space, when we think of surfing the web and navigating cyberspace, the materiality of these conditions appears to be simply a material excess to spirit's exploration. With materiality as a contingency, and with the collapse of space, with the collapse of place, the catastrophic effects upon nature are completely out of sight and out of mind. Batteries, for example, are a hazardous waste when they reach the end of their use, but for most of us, we don't think about the 78 million batteries disposed of worldwide daily. For cyberspace, via its logic of interconnection and flattening, it fundamentally collapses place. Clinton Burnham suggests in his text, Does the Internet Have an Unconscious?, that digital neighbors are next to each other, but indifferent to each other. Indeed, we have made the vast difference of physical placement completely indifferent when I can hop on a call with someone halfway around the world. People, of course, fall in love while living in separate countries via cyberspace, and this love can certainly be the real thing. And it's made possible by the collapse of place brought about by cyberspace. So there is, of course, an important dialectic emergent for spirit that results from the collapsing of physical place. We're indifferent to place in some disastrous ways, but in other ways that deepen community and can even open up avenues for love. Indeed, one of the central ontological questions of cyberspace is, where is it? We struggle to answer this question. There is, of course, the famous joke from the 2001 film Zoolander. I think this is a great one. Owen Wilson, who plays the very fashionable but not so bright model, infiltrates an office in search of incriminating evidence. The files are in the computer, one of the characters tells Owen Wilson. The files are in the computer, he repeats back in awe. He throws the computer to the ground, hoping to expose the files. This comedic scene demonstrates that there's nothing inside the computer except modem, CPUs, plastic, metal configuration. Where are the files? Well, they've been stored on a memory chip, on the computer, in a local server, or in a mega server at some indeterminate distance away. So one of the central ways to answer this question, where is cyberspace, is to consider that every day when you open your computer, you stare at a copy of a website. Millions of people can simultaneously stare at their own copies of the same website. With copies being updated and altered in real time, there's a sense that we're all staring at the exact same page, but in fact, we're looking at our own copy. Where's the original? Perhaps it originates in the programmer's computer, but the question of originality, it shrinks in its saliency, as it's a dissemination of copies that underlines the nature of cyberspace and thus upends constraints of physical place. Hence, the sites of cyberspace totally upend traditional notions of physical sites, of physical places. Place for Hegel in the philosophy of nature is a sublation of the point in space. He writes, "The point, as thus concrete, is place." Points in relation cut into the indifference of space to form concrete sites. I can sublate the indifferent space here by points and say this is now a place. So we must ask, what happens when physical place is once again sublated? Have we sublated the concretion of place with the indifference of cyberspace? We have. So it's not that we've gone backwards from space to place to space. Cyberspace presents another sublation of natural space. It is physical precisely in that it is accessible anywhere. This is one of its central paradoxes. It represents a place without place, sites without sites. The implication is that the indifference of space redoubles. We are completely indifferent to nature, to physical place, even to the point where it's become socially acceptable to immerse yourself in cyberspace at the cost of those around you. This could mean playing video games for 24 hours straight while ignoring your physical needs, or scrolling through reels at full volume on public transportation. Too much online engagement led to the popular phrase touch grass. In other words, we've become increasingly alienated from nature because we've effaced the notion of place. Effectively, the dialectic at play is that cyberspace has huge costs to nature, and it likewise minimizes our relationship with nature, particularly by eliminating physical place and creating an entirely new online place, a cyber place. Without originals and without a stake in physical place, it has been remarked that we deal only with simulacra, per Baudrillard's 1985 text, Simulacra and Simulation. Let's look at one line from this text, where Baudrillard writes that the real is now, I quote, a hyperreal, produced from a radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere, end quote. For Baudrillard, simulacra abstract from reality, meaning that we have produced representations without grounding, or they become their own ground. Here, the quote on a hyperspace without atmosphere is nonetheless more compelling for our discussion of cyberspace. Is there an atmosphere, i.e., is there really a space in cyberspace, or are there just cyber objects? Print media, the telephone, radio, television, all share this quality of effacing place, enabling communication and disseminating copies with decreasingly relevant original form. It is cyberspace that enables the user to feed back into the medium, to interact in real time with a massive community, and to upend place in a more radical way where the user is not just a recipient of information, but a producer of it and an active reactor to it. The avatar qua spirit is also copied over many times, appearing on screens around the world. A hologram of the avatar, to quote Baudrillard, quote, gives us the feeling, the vertigo of passing to the other side of our own body, to the side of the double, luminous clone or dead twin that is never born in our place and watches over us by anticipation, end quote. So to reflect on Baudrillard's prescient contribution to the question of cyberspace, one must remark that spirit always abstracts nature, that the development of spirit is always a vertiginous one, an externalization just like this luminous clone, this avatar that we nonetheless identify with as ourselves. My argument is that this hologram of spirit really shouldn't shock us. Spirit is always a hologram of itself. Hence, let's turn to spirit now and to its necessarily artificial character. So this is section 5 on spirit, the spirit of cyberspace. This is an important point. For Hegel, spirit is not natural. Spirit does, however, contingently emerge from nature. As spirited beings, we are embodied. As discussed earlier, spirit is a bone, insofar as there is both a material excess to spirit, but likewise, as Valadin Delar puts it in his article, What's the Matter?, insofar as spirit is capable of thinking its radical otherness of materiality. It shapes and structures materiality by first labeling it materiality, nature. It bestows upon nature the dignity of the concept, to quote Delar. Hegel writes that nature is what spirit imagines there when spirit closes its eyes. While there is no doubt that humans are animals, what defines us is that we have distinguished ourselves from nature. Spatially, spirited beings are a natural externality that have externalized themselves once again. We are a redoubled externality in a spatial sense. In the last paragraph of Hegel's Nature, he writes, quote, "Through the sublation of the immediacy of its reality, nature, subjectivity has coalesced with itself. The last self-externality of nature has been sublated, and the notion, which in nature is present only in principle, has become for itself," end quote. Because nature is immediate, sensuous, and external, its immediacy is mediated by spirit. We name nature, we give it a concept. This is what spirit does. It organizes nature. This is an artificial process by definition. It's a transformation of nature, a denaturalization of nature. In its development, spirit externalizes itself onto an external body, a misidentification of Lacanian proportions. In Philosophy of Spirit, Hegel writes, quote, "The soul, when its bodilessness has been thoroughly trained and made its own, becomes an individual subject for itself, and bodilessness is thus the externality as a predicate, in which the subject is related only to itself. This externality represents not itself, but the soul, of which it is the sign." So this is actually, that's the end of the quote. This is actually the first instance the word sign, Zeichen, appears in the Philosophy of Spirit. The soul externalizes itself onto the body, and the body represents the soul as a sign. The point I want to emphasize is twofold. First, the process of spirit's development is one of a continuous externalization and alienation of itself. Once it has externalized itself, it rejoins with itself. What matters is that spirit is organized around this gap between itself and its redoubled artifice. Hence, the second point is that spirit is necessarily artificial. It abstracts itself from nature. Here, the body is not natural in its immediacy, but is now transformed into a sign. As Frank Ruda develops in his book, Indifference to Repetition, freedom is not a natural capacity. It does not exist in a state of nature. Freedom is the radical stepping outside of our naturalized circumstances to do something genuinely new and different. If we keep doing the same old thing every day, if we naturalize our activities via mindless habits, we're not really free. Cyberspace is consistently referred to as artificial, both in terms of its materiality, cold plastics and metals, and also in terms of its Baudrillardian simulacra it produces as objects. In common discourse, cyberspace and spirit are juxtaposed as incongruous, with the assumption that the former is artificial and the latter is natural. It's been remarked that cyberspace is artificial and this damages spirit, hence we should go outside and again touch grass. Without a doubt, cyberspace has disastrous effects for spirit, but what I argue is it's not because it's artificial. Spirit is itself artificial. In fact, it's the opposite problem. The habits we form around cyberspace that we have naturalized, checking our phones constantly for new notifications, for example, these naturalized habits, those are the antithesis of freedom. So the next point I want to make is to examine the artificiality of language. Understanding, Hegel tells us, is a miracle, he writes, by which we come to make sense of the world. But it's likewise, he tells us, a violence that cuts the world up into pieces. Language disentangles an otherwise entangled, multiplicitous world. What cyberspace does, I argue, is redouble this artificiality. It's a space full of places that have an increasingly vanishing link to nature, as we just saw. But moreover, cyberspace folds the artificiality of language back upon itself. The example here is LLMs, large language models, such as ChatGPT. The language by which spirited beings have cut up the world with, have flattened out the world with, that is what we do. We've sorted it into little boxes. It's fed into the LLM algorithm. While spirited beings are trained, that's us, we're trained on sensuous certainty, on language and of other spirited beings. LLMs are only trained on language that is uploaded and on other LLMs. There's one more abstraction away from nature. This is a redoubled artificiality. That said, what we actually read when we read LLM-generated text is our own language that has been reorganized by an algorithm. It's a redoubled artificiality in this way, a doubled abstraction that often irons the edges of the world out in a way that appears out of joint to spirit. So what does this mean for space? There are two questions to address here. What are the effects of the redoubled artificiality of cyberspace upon spirited beings? And second, can cyber objects like AI step outside of themselves to create a new artificial spirit, i.e. gain consciousness? To the first question of redoubled artifice, this is simply another alienation of spirit from itself in a continuously alienating process. Without a stake of natural place in the ground, we, of course, risk further alienation from spirited beings, which has, of course, led to depression, lack of in-person social engagements, and a lack of political organization. But we likewise connect to each other from afar. LLMs, it should be heavily warned, obscure what fundamentally defines us as spirited beings, our language. Language is a function of alienation and creation. To rejumble language into nonsensical outputs, to divorce language from reason, to divorce language from thought, that is what LLMs do. It's very dangerous. Thus, a spatial flattening between spirited beings has its dialectical pros and cons, bringing people close together without natural place. But the linguistic cutouts that are once more cut out and organized by a quantitative algorithm, this should be rejected by reasonable creatures. It's one thing for AI to operate a machine, crunch data, let's say, and determine a machine pathway. But for AI to consider questions like, summarize the phenomenology of spirit for me, one must realize that this is a rejumbling of all the online summaries of the phenomenology and is not guided by reason, but by a statistical gambling that one word ought to follow the next. So to my second question, why can't machines reason? On the most basic level, the algorithm can't step outside of itself. There's no space for it to do so. Like we've discussed, spirit is what alienates itself and rejoins with itself. Spirit ontologically is, to quote Hegel, beside itself. Es ist außer sich gekommen, he writes of spirit in the master-slave section of the Phenomenology. Algorithms, programs, what they do what they're programmed to do. As Douglas Hofstadter put it in his text, Gödel, Escher, Bach, what differentiates machine learning and human learning is that when presented with an impossible task, the human will eventually walk away. The machine is incapable of stepping outside the algorithm and thus of stepping outside of itself. Thus, my thesis is that cyberspace is actually not there. There is no space for the algorithm to step into, to step outside of itself. Thus, cyberspace functions as a way for spirit to alienate itself, but cyber objects lack a cyberspace to alienate themselves within. It would be better to call cyberspace cyberplace. Section 6, this is my conclusion. Cyberspace is composed of particular places that we call sites, but is it really a space? It seems that there's no space between sites themselves. There are only sites which have no physical place. There are cyber places, but there is no cyberspace, as it were. The space between cyberplace can only be described as information carried over fiber optic cables, stored on CPU chips, powered by batteries. This isn't a physical material rendering of the space between sites. But perhaps it's in waiting for the page to load that we confront the emptiness of the internet. When a 404 error occurs, when library Genesis is taken down by the authorities and the URL lands at a defunct site. Perhaps then we can see the negativity of the internet, its empty space, an empty site where a site once was or should be. Cyberspace as such, space without place, as indeterminate, indifferent, and indefinite, this space is precisely an error. So here we do have some nice contradiction that can emerge. Cyberspace is something that works. It executes tasks we assign to it. In its inability to work, to run, it stops working, it freezes. Hence, it's precisely when we don't have cyberspace that we have cyberspace. Hence, in creating place without place, sites without sites, we've created space without space. Cyberspace functions primarily as an extension of spirit, but one that is compressed like the data it transmits. It's a space of feedback, or rather a place of feedback. Feedback that's always placed. The space of feedback is completely enclosed. It's contained within a program. There can no doubt be art, literature, poetry, love that takes place in cyberspace. Cyberspace is, after all, an extension of spirit. But cyberspace lacks space itself. It does not open up to a horizon of freedom. It's still up to spirit to steer itself into spirited horizons, to be the helmsperson of its ship, through which its tools can open new horizons. The tool itself, the wooden knobs, cyberspace, these are the remainder of what can enable a genuine spirited act of freedom, of opening of a new space for spirit to explore. Thank you.